Hi and welcome to the explanation of the QRI-5 Chapter 1. The QRI-5 is administered individually, which is what we're going to be doing for 562. I do want you to know it can also be administered to the whole class if you're only having them read silently the passages and having them answer the comprehension questions. The information which we're going to obtain is the student's independent, instructional, and frustration level. We're going to find it for the word list as well as we're going to find it for the passages. Now, in order to determine their independent, instructional, and frustration level, when the child is reading orally, you are marking their miscues, and so that's the word identification score. Then you're going to have them answer the comprehension questions. And you take the word identification score, the comprehension score, and whichever the score is lower, that's the overall score for that passage. They do have the opportunity to read different types of text, narrative and expository, with and without pictures, information that's familiar to them and unfamiliar. I am asking you to have the students read narrative passages. When you find their instructional level at the narrative, you then give them that same level in an expository in order that you can compare their ability to read narrative and expository and what level text you would have them reading on. With the QRI-5, we're able to administer oral or silent. I only administer silent to those students who are reading silently within their regular classroom. Then if I am working with a student who is reading silently in their classroom, I also always include an oral so I can determine their miscues and do a miscue analysis. The QRI-5 does provide for lookbacks. Again, that's 3rd through high school, so my older students would be doing this. A look back is when I have asked all questions, kind of completed the assessment, but there's some areas where I feel like the student may know a little bit more, but they just weren't real clear on their answers. I give the passage back to the student, ask them the question again, and have them skim and scan to find their answer. If you give this concept back to the student, ask them to look for this answer for this question, and they start from the beginning of rereading it word for word, you can stop. What you want them to do is a look back where they skim and scan. My older students know how to do this because someone has taught them. My younger students are not successful with this, and it's not a time when I'm doing my assessment to teach them, though I would note, oh, I need to work with this child on skimming and scanning. The QRI-5 also provides for think alouds, and it's usually conducted with 6th through high school students. In the text, it tells you there's a stop sign. It tells you where to stop and ask them, what is their thinking process? What does this make you think of, to see if they're making that mental picture, if they're making that connection with their prior knowledge, if they're doing inferencing. It helps you to determine their ability to think critically with the text. You note their strengths and weaknesses, and then you plan instruction based on that. I use the information to make my groups. When I'm doing my guided reading, I'm going to group those students who have similar strengths and weaknesses together to make my time most effective. I'm going to use the information I obtained from the QRI-5 to determine which text the groups of students and individual students should be reading. It helps to design my intervention. Based on their miscues, phonetically, I determine what instruction I'm going to provide. Based on their ability to retell, based on their ability to provide the answers for literal, explicit, if I'm asking them to do inferential questioning, I'm going to base my instruction on their ability to perform these tasks. Remember, I want to know what their strengths are because I always start my instruction with a student's strength. Success builds success, and so I need to find out what they're capable of, what they're good at, and that's where I start. The other thing that I always want to do is I want us to chart their growth. I want my students to help me charting their growth. So we could chart their words per minute, their level of words. We could chart their ability to recall, how many ideas or facts they could recall. Their ability to answer explicit questions, implicit questions. The assessment materials that are in your QRI-5 are the graded word list. The word list start on page 100 of your QRI-5 manual. The student word lists run from 100 until 104. On page 105 are your scoring sheets of the same word list. I've also provided the PowerPoints and the sheets that you can print that you're going to give the students one word at a time. You score it on the examiner word list page starting on 105 and running through 111. Page 111 is the analogy word list. So if you look, the pre-primer and first grade are phonetically regular vowel patterns. Those are their sight words. Pre-primer 1, pre-primer 2, 3, primer, and first grade. If you administer any of those word lists, pre-primer 1, pre-primer 2, 3, primer, or first grade, you also need to provide an assessment of the analogy low-frequency words which have the same phonograms. The sheet for the students is page 104, and the score sheet which you use is page 111. On page 111, you have 3 low-frequency analogy words for the pre-primer 1. You have 4 low-frequency for the pre-primer 1. You have 6 for the pre-primer 2 level. You have 5 for the primer level, and you have 3 for the first grade. You then compare. Were they able to say the sight word? And then were they able to make that analogy, taking off the initial onset and changing it to make it the low-frequency word? There are numerous passages. You can give them oral and silent. We're giving every student oral. If they are reading silently in their regular classroom, we will also allow them to do a silent reading and compare their comprehension performance. We have expository and narrative passages, and they are labeled as such. The passages start on page 112, the section for the students to read, and then right after each section is the scoring sheet for the evaluator. So the story that starts on 111, the scoring sheet is on page 133. It's a pre-primer 1, it's a narrative. Each one is labeled for us. Once you find their instructional narrative passage level, find an expository on that same level, and you must administer it to the students to determine is that their instructional level as well. There are leveled passages pre-primer through high school. The passages are pre-primer through second, come with and without pictures. There are narrative and expository. It starts with asking them if they are familiar or unfamiliar with the text with the prior knowledge questions. If they score 55% or higher, they're familiar. If they score less than 55%, they are unfamiliar, and you ask them the prediction task. The text topics are listed. When you're assessing comprehension, as soon as they finish reading, you move the passage away and you ask them to retell the stories if they're telling it to someone who's never heard it before. If you look at the scoring sheet on page 133. There were the concept questions. There I score. The prediction if it's 55% or less. The story that they're going to read, I can. There, where you mark their miscues. We're going to be doing number of total miscues. So it's total accuracy. Then there's a place for retelling. There were 12 ideas. I asked my student to retell. I score. I get a number. And then I go to the questions. There are 5 questions. The questions and the answers are provided for me, and I quickly score it. I take the score from the comprehension and the score from the oral reading to determine the overall passage. Is it independent, instructional, or frustration? We have questions. When prompted, we give them the prompt. Then they can do, if possible, the lookbacks if they're able to skim and scan in 3rd grade or higher. And then if they're in 6th grade or higher, the think alouds. We're going to ask explicit and implicit questions. They're labeled in the manual. Explicit meaning right there in the text. Implicit where they infer. Here's our lookbacks if we're only working with those students who are in the higher grades. And if we're lookbacks are those students who are able to skim and scan. They mentioned 3rd grade, but only if the child has that capability. The think alouds is 6th grade, upper middle school, and high school, where they are actually going to verbalize their thinking process to you. There is a stop sign in the manual which tells you this is where I actually stop and ask them to think and verbalize their thinking process. Again, the decisions that I make based on my QRI-5 information is how do I group students? What text will these students be reading from? What instruction am I going to provide them? What are their strengths? And that's where I start with, so I can help them to feel successful. And where and what am I going to chart? I hope you find this information helpful.